When she married Bres the beautiful, Bres the handsome, Bres the charming, Brigid, high-born maid of the Tuatha De Danann, the gods of ancient Ireland, did not marry him for love. She married him for peace. But perhaps when I say she did not marry him for love, that is not entirely fair. She did not marry him for any Mills and Boon romantic love for this handsome, charming devil that was before her, but she did marry him for love of her own people, and the peace that could be brokered between her people and the family from which Bres came. And whilst Bres was as beautiful as the morning light, his parents, his brothers, his sisters, his aunts, his uncles, his cousins, the kin from which he came were creatures of the ocean depth, slithering and slimy and slobbering and scaled and monstrous. Creatures, the Fomori, who had raided Ireland 1,000 times over, had killed and maimed and robbed and plagued the people of the land in 100 different ways, and made for themselves a name so terrible that to this day it is a byword for tyranny. Not because of their awful and hideous appearance, because, as Bres himself is illustration too, merely having a beautiful face or an ugly face is no guarantee of what is in here, but because of their wickedness, their cruelty, their avarice, their brutality, their indifference to the suffering of others, indeed, in some cases, their positive enjoyment of the suffering of others. Now, when she married him and lay in their marriage bed together and sealed the contract, for the contract was not sealed by the ritual of wedding alone, but by the ritual of bedding, she must have been aware, clearly, that the child of their union would be of mixed race. He would take after half his father and half his mother, as is always the case. She must have hoped that perhaps if he were to take after his father, it would be in looks alone, and that his heart, his soul, his courage, his character would be of the Tuatha side, of his mother's side. And she must have known, even as she entered the bedchamber for that very first time on the wedding night with Bres, that this was a marriage that might not end well. Like any bride, I'm sure she must have hoped that it would, but as a warrior woman, a strategist, she must have known that the chances were not fantastic. And so it came to pass. In the first few years, the marriage was as good as any royal marriage might be. Not one of great romance, great love or great affection, but one of respect, one of counsel given and counsel heeded, one which produced an heir, just the one heir, in the form of Ruadan, that little flame-haired child that had the looks of his father, handsome and charming even as a toddler, and seemed to have the moral courage, the wisdom, the knowledge and the insight of his mother, seemed, who grew, as all such mixed blood beings do grow, at great rate. And for the first few years, as I say, that marriage was a good enough marriage. And the judgments of Bres in the first few years, once he inherited the throne and came into his power over the Tuatha, were, well, maybe not the stuff of legend, but were good enough decisions, good enough forms of leadership. But little by little, he started to ignore the counsel of his wife. Little by little, year after year, he started to make decisions that were just not full on wrong, just not quite right. Little by little, callousness crept in to the judgments he gave in his role as chieftain, as arbiter of justice in the courts, making decisions over crime and over the division of land and inheritances and all of the manner of deeds that a court of law must deal with. That callousness, that disregard for the weak, for the vulnerable, began to creep in. And the decisions he made in battle, for there, although the land was mostly at peace, there was always battle somewhere going on. The decisions he made were not forgiving ones, were not ones designed to broker long-term peace when enemies were vanquished, but were ones marked by vindictiveness and spite and harsh retribution. Little by little, his fosterage of music, of storytelling, of the arts, of athletic performances, of all of the wonderful things that entertain people in the royal courts of ancient times, were given less and less to the quality of art and more to cruelty, to cruel spectacles and jesters and those set to amuse, but amuse in a way that was often callous and cruel and spiteful. An art that was less and less about beauty and more about ugliness. And little by little the court became corrupted by the very presence of Bres at its head. And as the people of the distant east tell us, the fish rots from the top down. And so the presence, the influence, the might of the Fomori, of that side of the family, became more and more dominant in the land. Their needs, their demands, their wishes became more to the fore. And those of the Tuatha and the other peoples of the land, like the Verbolg, became less and less. Till the day when terrible levies were demanded by the people of the ocean depths. Great burdensome taxes. And instead of respecting and honouring the peoples of the land for their gifts and their talents, the noble and learned, like Ockma, were sent out to gather firewood as a labourer. And the wise and benevolent and druidic, like the Dagda, father-in-law of the king, instead of being a figure of immense respect, was put to digging ditches and lugging great boulders with which to build walls and palisades. In turn, one after another was ill-used, ill-respected, their talents squandered, put to things better suited to others, and those others who would have been doing those jobs were put to equally unsuitable tasks for their own talents and abilities. Until finally the burden of taxation grew so crippling. The demands for not simply money but cattle and crops and even slaves grew so monstrous that the Tuatha rebelled, drove out their wicked king, their corrupt king, not his queen, not his child, for she was a figure of immense respect and everyone knew that she had been counselling. Brigid had been counselling her husband to do other than that which he did, and they embraced the child as one of their own, despite he being the son of his father. But the king himself was shown the door, and council met to discuss who the new monarch should be. But Bres, having been turfed out of his seat, went to his own family, his own kin, to his parents and his siblings and his cousins and his aunts and his uncles, and raged and roared at the displacement that had been done to him, at the dishonour that had been done to him by these upstarts who would not accept his totalitarian rulership of the people. For the way of leadership amongst the Fomori was even then very different from the way of leadership amongst the Tuatha. And so he rallied the troops of his own bloodline to sweep into Ireland, to slaughter and oppress and enslave and maim, and the land descended into warfare. Gods on one side, and the Fomori, the sea giants, on the other, clashing and gouging and goring and ripping and tearing at each other, day after day, week after week, month after month, blood and ichor soaked into the very soil of Ireland. Carnage was to be found in all quarters of the land, not simply around the coast where the Fomori lived, but into the very heart of Ireland itself. And by this time, such was the rate of growth for those who mix the blood of gods and the blood of sea giants in their veins, that the little flame-haired lad, Ruadan, was no longer little and no longer a lad. He was now a strapping great man with the build and the muscles and the might of his father, and the battle strategies of his mother burning in his mind, the skills and gifts of both sides of his family. And unlike just about everyone else in the land, he was one of the very few who could come and go between both camps, who was accepted by the Fomori as being of Fomori blood, and accepted by the Tuatha as being of the divine blood. And so, as a diplomat, he was free to come and go between the two. But, as his mother must have known, even on the very day she gave birth to him, one day he might have faced a crossroads, a choice, to turn left or right, east or west, to make a decision as to which side of his blood would be dominant. And whilst his mother, in the very act of giving birth to him, must have hoped it was only a possibility, something that she would have prayed, have hoped, have worked her heart out for, never to have come to pass, now it did come to pass. And on one of his visits to see his father and his grandparents and his aunts and his uncles and his cousins over in the ocean wave, it was put to him by the council of warlords of the Fomori, of which his father was one, that they were losing the battle. The tide was turning against them, and they were used to controlling the tide in more ways than one. They were not used to things turning against them. Warriors whom they battled and beat to a pulp and cut and slashed and ripped and tore, one day would be whole and hearty the next. And weapons that had been smashed into skull and shoulder and tentacle and tail, hacking and slashing and tearing until they were blunted one day, would be as sharp as an eagle's talons, as sharp as a shark's tooth the next. How was it possible? When their own injured stayed injured, their own blunted weapons stayed blunted. What was the secret of the gods? And they charged Ruadan to cease to be a diplomat going between the sides and to become instead a spy, a double agent. And he journeyed to the lands of his mother's people and was welcomed with open arms and not a hint of suspicion from anyone, and travelled the land seeing what he could see. He went to the great well of healing, and he went to the blacksmithy of Govna, the great craftsman, and of the two fellow craftsmen who served side by side in the smithy's forge, creating works of art. And he watched and he observed. And then, a few days later, he returned to his father's people, and he reported there what he had seen in great detail. He reported that around the great wells of healing, which had always provided healing waters for his people, the power of these wells had been harnessed and enhanced significantly. Once upon a time they would have cured warts and toothache and sore backs. Now they were restoring the 3/4 dead to fully functioning life, because they were the 4 mightiest healers in the land. performing rituals and ceremonies and dancing around the wells of healing, taking out cauldrons full of water, casting in herbs, reciting incantations and spells, giving the potions to the injured, smoothing their wounds with the ointments, packing their broken and shattered bones with poultices soaked in the waters and the magical herbs that had been cast into these cauldrons of water from the well, and lo and behold, within a matter of hours, the near dead would be back upon their feet again, fully functioning. And he reported too what he had seen in the smithy, how he had seen Govna, the mightiest of the blacksmiths in the land, creating the most ornate and fabulous and enchanted weapons possessed of power such that some of them were swords whose blades burst into flame, and others were axes that could fell the mightiest tree with a single chop, and others were arrowheads that could fly for miles and always meet their target no matter how fast they ran and in which direction they ran. Weapon after weapon would Govnu churn out in his smithy. And there, besides him, aiding him, was Lotta, the carpenter, gifted in the magic of wood, creating spear shafts and sword handles and arrow shafts and shields and clubs and staves, all manner of things that each were as magical as the metal articles turned out by the blacksmith, possessed of their own wondrous powers. And there was Krednikeda, the goldsmith, for it was his duty to make sure that these weapons were not ugly functional items churned out like something from a factory, as in our day and age, but rather to decorate these items with filigrees of gold and chasings of silver and jewels and precious stones, to make them works of beauty and art, such that when the basic shape and form was made out of iron by Govnu or out of wood by Lotta the carpenter, they would pass them to him, and he would put the finishing final details in, the added levels of extra magic and sophistication that turned these weapons into things of wonder. And further than this, there was the old woman Kron. And Kron would sit there with her whetstones, her sharpening wheels, and she would take the blunted weapons brought to her by warriors, spears and arrowheads and sword blades and daggers and axes, and blunt though they might be and useless, she would spend hour after hour sharpening the blades on her whetstones, sharpening them on the turning wheels until they were like the teeth of shark in the talons of eagles, and return the weapons to their owners, to be used again as deadly the next day as they were on the day previous. And these sources of power, these people of talent and art and craft, were what were turning the tide against the Fomori, and would undoubtedly, Ruadan assured them, within a matter of weeks succeed in defeating the Fomori entirely, for he, having visited both sides, knew exactly the scale of forces on one side and the scale of forces on the other, and could see that balance tilting, and predicted with his mind for strategy inherited from his mother Brigid that this is what would happen. And his father, and his aunts, and his uncles, and his grandparents, and his cousins said to him, "Return to your mother's land. Go to the smithy. Slaughter one of them, it doesn't matter which one, slaughter one of them, that they should no longer have their powers, and then from there go to the well of healing and slaughter at least one, if not all, of the healers, to again break the power of their healing arts. This is the only way it may be done. For if we go into the land, we will not be able to get close enough to any of these places. They are so heavily guarded, we will be driven back. But you have the trust of your mother's people. And they know not the deception in your heart. They do not understand that you are loyal to your father's people alone. So use that trust to get close to them and then strike that blow. And of course the people of the Fomori never once mentioned the word treachery, but it would have been in the heart of Ruadan, for he must have known that what he was doing was to serve one side of his family by betraying the other. But he did as they told him. The next day he journeyed, meeting a warm welcome at every turn, offers of food and drink and hospitality. He journeyed across the land, turning down the welcome offers, turning them down, and making his way to the smithy. And there he watched the activities of the three master craftsmen and the old woman with the whetstones and the sharpening wheels. And he laughed and he joked, and though he be a villain, he smiled and smiled and smiled. And at length he asked the man who was his own uncle, he asked Governor to make him a weapon, that he might fight in the battle, for up until now, as a diplomat, he had not fought, but rather had gone back and forth, trying to broker deals, trying to broker peace. And Governor asked him if he really wanted to do this. Did he really want to take his mother's side against his father's? Was this truly in his heart, that he should now be a carrier of weapons? But Ruadan said, yes, uncle, this is truly what I want. I want to be a carrier of weapons. I want a weapon of the greatest magic that you can make, that I can take it onto the battlefield and fight on behalf of the Tuatha against the Fomori and break my ties with them forevermore. Well, the uncle thought this was an unwise move, but a request is a request, and so he met it. And for days he laboured at the making of a spear. And he made the spearhead, while Luchta made the spear shaft. And between them they joined the two together into a thing of beauty. And then for days and days the goldsmith worked upon the engravings and the filigree and the stones and jewels that bedecked this spear, this thing of wonder, a weapon of mightiest magic. And finally, in all that time, Ruadan sitting and watching and eating and drinking and falling asleep by the heat of the hearth as day after day went and came and went and came. At length the weapon was done, and the smith, polishing it up, presented it to his nephew and said, "Here is your spear, here is the weapon which will aid you to turn against your people, if that is what you wish." And Ruadan picked it and he weighed it and he thought, "Uncle, I thank you. Indeed, this gift will be the one that I use to turn against my people." And without another word, he rammed it into his uncle. But in the split second between the decision in Ruadan's mind and the deed, Governor had turned back to pick up one of his hammers from the smithy to go back to work. And so the weapon pierced not his heart, but his side. And grievous wound though it was, Governor roared and staggered, the blood gouting. Everyone else in the smithy, horrified by what they were seeing, screaming, crying, shouting. People came running from miles around to see what was going on. Such was the hullabaloo. The spear dropped to the floor, and Governor picked it up and lobbed it with all of the force that he could muster, wounded and injured grievously though he was, lobbed it, and it pierced the heart of Ruadan and came out the other side. And the young man fell dead upon the floor, fell dead at the feet of his own mother, who had come running to see what the screaming and crying and shouting and wailing was. She had, as she was running, seen the wound in her brother's side, the gouting of the blood, seen the look of malice upon the face of her own son, seen the looks of horrors and the pointing fingers of accusation from those others gathered in the smithy, and realised that it must have been he who had rammed the spear into Governor's side, and then seen that very same spear thrust straight through her son's heart, piercing it out to the other side and killing him. And, as any mother would, she wailed, even knowing that this was a just deed of self-defence by her brother, and not blaming him in the slightest for this act to protect his own life and those of his fellow smiths, or fellow craftspeople. Even so that the grief near broke her heart in that moment. She threw back her head, she howled, she wailed, the tears streamed down her face, and she began to sing a lament. She began to keen for the very first time in Ireland, and she lifted up her cloak and wrapped it over her head and rocked and rocked and rocked in a gesture known from that day to this very day as an expression of deepest grief, held to by the women of Ireland. And her keening, her song, her lamentation, her ululation, like the howling of the loneliest wolf, echoed the mountain tops and the valleys, the forests and the bogs of Ireland, echoed even out to sea, such that amongst the Fomori, Bres, the father, the beautiful, knew that his son's heart had been shattered, that his wife's heart had been shattered. And so ends the story of Ruadan. But the story of Brigid, of course, continued on, for although her heart broke, she recovered in time and became the greatest of healers, and became the greatest of smiths, and became the greatest of poets, and led the mourning from that day on for every one of the Tuatha who fell and died, and taught her skills to the women of Ireland in due course, when mortals came to populate the land, so that they might in their turn mourn their own sons and daughters, their own husbands and brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and uncles and aunts and friends, from that day forth to this. But it is wise to remember, before we sit and we mourn and we keen, to make sure that the dead are truly dead. For those unwise enough to mourn too soon, when the soul still clings to life, and there is yet hope of recovery, may summons the dogs from the land of the dead, the dogs of Down, the dogs of Vindos, from the land beyond, to come and collect the soul before it is quite yet ready, for it is they who answer the ululations to this day, just as they answered the keening on the day that Ruadan fell dead upon the soil of Brigid.